Okay, welcome to this second part of this podcast with Patrick Dunne. And we're now going to be talking about director duties and liabilities. Patrick, I wanted to ask you a question. I know that there are lots of conversation about the legal duties. There are lots of conversation about how much education does one need to have in order to be a board director. Uh, so in your view, what is the biggest misconception the directors have about the legal duties, but also, people in general? Tell me your views.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there's the sort of general duties and liabilities which apply to all directors, and those are really governed by the law. Um, there are the duties and liabilities which are sort of expected of you. If you're in a listed company, for example, there will be codes of corporate governance which, they're there for investors, which it is assumed that you will, behave in a certain way, do certain things. And so in most countries, the stock exchanges have those fairly public. And then there are the very specific ones relating to your particular company or organization. And these, often people don't look at the Articles of Association before they take on a board role. And there may be things in the articles, which some may be historic, some may be more recent, which are very specific to that company, that organization. And often people aren't aware of those things. Excuse me. I think for people taking their first appointment, it's a very good idea to go on one of the courses. They're available in most countries. Usually, a company's legal advisors will be able to arrange something as well, a legal briefing before you take the appointment. And they would hopefully summarize, the law in the country, the law pertaining to that type of organization, if it's a public company, as I said before. And also, here's a summary of things in the Articles of Association of the company which might be different. And then clearly in the area where I spent a lot of my experience in private equity or venture or growth capital area, there will be investment agreements. There will also be banking agreements, and these are contracts. So therefore, you have a you have a duty to be aware of what they are, and also to understand, what the key obligations are for the company in meeting those. Key in those will be if it's a buyout, for example, would be the covenants that the banks will expect you to adhere to. So they may be, financial, or they may be in terms of other things such as remuneration or the purchase of assets or the sale of assets or various other things. So I think there's quite a lot to be aware of, but I would put it in those three buckets of the general, the codes, and then the specific things relating to that particular company.
Thank you, Patrick. In actual fact, we see a flourishing of sites where we find, for example, advertisement about non-executive director position or non-executive director network. And most of the time, we tend to see there's probably a bit of confusion between general advisory and non-executive directorship. Now, I personally have done my Financial Times board director program, and some other people have done this, but as you rightly mentioned, Patrick, it's about really a strong knowledge eventually about the laws, because, as a director, when you become officially director, you have to have, certain duties, yeah, that they go well beyond the normal advisory. And you mentioned about investment agreement. I've actually been part of a business in which I was not a director, I was a fractional CFO, but I remember I had to report every month with board pack about the investment agreement and how this was progressing against the agreement effectively. Yeah. So how the business was progressing against the agreement. So thank you very much for pointing those out. That leads me to the next question. So I wanted to ask you is so we know that there is individual accountability. Yeah. So directors are individually accountable. However, the board is like a team, yeah. It's not just one person. So so yeah, each director, has a certain responsibility, has a certain accountability. But how do we balance the overall collective board responsibility with individual accountability?
Yes, and I think at the heart of this is something I didn't mention in the previous point because I wanted to make it here is I mean one of the first things is are any potential conflicts of interest. So one of the things which we are individually accountable for is declaring whether we have a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest. It's the board's role to determine how conflicts of interest are dealt with and managed. So it might be, if you're on the board of a number of companies, you might get approached by someone to say, we're thinking of selling, would you be interested? And dealing with that. There might be financial conflicts of interest as well. So, you may have a preference for one decision over another because that will be, in terms of your personal position, that will be better for you or not. So, how you manage all of those things. And the best way to do that really is in the appointment letter that you get when you are appointed to be a board member, which, I mean, I think that is one thing that you should, again, if it's your first appointment, you may not be familiar with this, but you should ask for, a detailed appointment letter, not just a letter which says, we've approved your appointment to be on this board, but a letter which sets out what the role of the board is, what the role of the subcommittees are, what the role of the executive is, what your role will be, what the expectations on you are, as well as all the other detail about remuneration and time commitment and insurance, directors' insurance and all of those sorts of things. In terms of a good way of thinking about the balance between the collective responsibility and the individual one is to think about the approval of the accounts. It might sound a very boring thing, but if you are not a financially sophisticated person, might be a very good manager. You have obviously some familiarity with numbers. You've managed budgets. You've done all that kind of thing, but you're not sophisticated in accounting sense. Then you'll have an audit and risk committee typically, or an audit committee at least, and they will do the main work in terms of scrutinizing the accounts, the financial control systems, the financial dynamics of the organization, and so on. And they will usually make a recommendation to the board to approve the accounts. Now, at one end of the spectrum, you could say, "Oh, well, I don't need to do anything because I'm not a financially sophisticated person by the definition of regulators and so on." And I trust Matteo. He's a fantastic accountant. He can be responsible for that. That would be at one end of the spectrum. That's a very dangerous position to take. Much better to take the position and understand that your real responsibility and legal duty in most jurisdictions is you are signing these accounts, you are approving these accounts, as a board. You need to understand these accounts. You can't in a court later on say, "Oh, I didn't know. I'm not an accountant. How would I know? I'm a creative guy or I'm whatever it might be." It's your duty and you will be held accountable to make sure that you understand the accounts. And so where I'm chair, for example, I generally twice a year typically would get the finance director to talk through the whole board the financial dynamics of the organization and how they're changing. When you get to the approving the accounts, usually we would get the auditor in to talk to the board um, only, without the executive who are not on the board, and talk us through the accounts, what things we should be aware of, those kind of things. So you have that individual accountability as well as the collective one, and you can't abdicate your individual accountability because you think someone else in the collection is the expert. Most courts, I think, from what I've heard, are generally reasonable though, so they wouldn't expect, the level of understanding to be to be that of, someone who spent 20 years in auditing or someone who hasn't. But they would expect you to make the effort and they would expect you to try and understand and take, put the work in to do that.
Thank you, Patrick. You mentioned about conflict of interest, and yeah, especially for those who start the career as a non-executive director, as a portfolio director. Yeah, this is something that probably requires a bit of deeper sort of conversation, because most of the time we see people that would like to start to have a portfolio career, but conflict is something that they never had previously before they started the portfolio career. So something really, really important to as a consideration. And the other one is really, we often hear about, okay, what is the director duties, and one of the duties that is obvious that it doesn't get mentioned in my view as much as it should be, is the fact that the director has to really act in the for the best interest of the company. So yeah, sometimes even though in a career you wanted to stuck to one particular sector, it's actually a bit more difficult to stick to one sector when you're a portfolio director, because then there is more risk
More
of getting
likelihood. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
getting
that's that,
conflict of
that's true.
interest.
Yeah. But I think if you have a good conflicts of interest policy, and if you adhere to that, and if you have high integrity, and a good level of trust, but also scrutiny, then it's not too difficult in practice. Um,
Yeah, you can stay in more than one company in the same sector. Obviously, it's important to be
yeah.
aware of this of the nuances. Yeah.
Yeah.
So legal protection. What is your advice? Especially non-executive directors, those who are not really in the business every day, but they are part of the board, about legal protection, while obviously still, ensuring that the function is performed as in as a positive manner as possible, with as much impact as possible.
I mean, for me, I think, and it doesn't matter what size the company is, I think ensuring that there is someone fulfilling the company secretarial role, who is highly competent is really critical to this. So if you're a public company, that's generally an employee of the company who's going to be often head of legal and also company secretary. That's a common kind of situation. If it's a small company, a startup, where you don't have the resources to fund and you don't really have enough for them to do either, then you can buy in that service, you can outsource that service, but ensuring that you have someone who is ensuring that you have good company records, that you're complying with the laws and the regulations. Most sectors have, a fair degree of regulation around them. Some sectors, financial service, healthcare, food, chemical, other sectors that if something went wrong, it endangers people's lives, then they have fairly heavy regulation, and so it's ensuring that someone knows that, so that the chair and the directors, are constantly kept up to date with their obligations. So, where I'm chair, the company secretaries will usually be, sending an email to directors saying, just let you know there's a new piece of regulation coming out. This is how it would affect us. This is how it would affect you as a director. This is what we need to do to prepare ourselves for that, or, we need to change this policy or that policy, and so on. I think the board apps now, so Diligent, Board Intelligence, these apps that are designed for board directors, you get an information flow through them as well, which is quite helpful too. So there's a knowledge thing. I think there's a skills thing that, so if there are conflicts of interest, then how do you navigate those? How do you do that in a good and skillful way? And at their heart are the basics of conflict management, which is a whole separate subject. But I think if people are good at managing conflicting objectives, conflicting, goals, personalities, all of those things, then that's, I think investing in yourself to learn how to be good at managing conflict is probably a good thing. And at its heart, I think is the culture of the board, and also the culture of the organization, and ensuring that you have a culture which is one of accountability, of responsibility, of care. Those things actually really will help a great deal, because we can't always get everything right. But I think if we're trying to get things right, if we're putting the effort in, then, if we do, um, if something does go wrong, and people are more likely to be understanding than if you have, disregard for things. I think the interesting thing also is to really understand your stakeholders. What have you signed up for with those different stakeholders, no matter who they are, whether they're shareholders, staff, and so on. So do you really, excuse me, understand what you've signed up for with that? So I think it's a complex area, but I think the principles are really straightforward in terms of making sure you've got the knowledge, making sure you've got the right resources within the organization to fulfill those things and to support you and to alert you, and making sure you've got the right behaviors. And that's largely down to the culture, again, as I said earlier.
Thank you for such a comprehensive view about this. And I would add that given my experience as well, sometimes a further study the specific risk of a specific sector. I'll give an example. I used to work in the wastewater sector, and I used to sit on three boards simultaneously. And now remember how health and safety, for example, was such a bigger
Mm.
point to be mentioned to be respected every month on the board meeting. Yeah, so each sector has its own complication. So if you're a non-executive director and you're not in the business every day, but there are things that are really particularly important that happens every day that could affect your liability, your responsibility. Yeah, get on top of those as much as possible. I don't know about your view, Patrick, on this. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the very first company I worked for was a company called Air Products and Chemicals, and it was in the industrial gas business. And I remember my first day. I was just a graduate, and the sort of one of the motto of the company was safety first. And I was in a mathematical modeling job, modeling energy, modeling
Mhm.
distribution systems, and so on. So not handling, the industrial gases. But that very first day was devoted to, you really need to understand,
Mhm.
uh, why safety is so important to this business. We transport hydrogen, we transport liquid oxygen, stuff like this. And it was everything from, how you walk down the stairs, how you park your car if you have a car, all of these things, and double checking and treble checking, and you know, there was this fantastic culture of attention to detail, of thinking about the consequences, of system thinking. So, the effect of you being sloppy here will mean that, over here, something else could go wrong. And I really valued that. It was, you know, for some people would potentially find that excessive and obsessive, but actually it was great discipline. And they had an amazing record, particularly given the things that they were doing. They did the fuel for the space shuttle and stuff like this, and amazing record as a company. But it was that culture of safety first.
No, thank you. Let's come to the next part, which
Oh.
is about both structure and remuneration. And so I wanted to ask you a question. Now, regardless, well, especially when you are it's an early stage company, like a startup and a scale up, yeah. Um, the way in which companies should structure the board, yeah, in your view, because especially in those situations, we got founders who have to become effectively CEO, and then they need to start to delegate really the execution of the business to executive directors, and then executive directors that they come on board with the non-executive directors they will come on board with chairman and so on. So what skills and diversity matter the most when you really start to compose a board? Yeah.
Yeah, so in the startups I've been involved in, I think about, you have to think about what you are at this moment, and you have to think about what you want to be. And in terms of building a board, you need to be sort of slightly ahead, in terms of from what you are to what you want to be. So, if I think of ESSA, for example, which we started in 2016, so it's nearly 10 years old. So in the beginning, there was myself as the founder, and there was a friend who believed also in the thing that we were wanting to do, Chris, great guy, Chris Boy, and we ultimately wanted to have a board because ESSA is working on big systemic problems in African education. We ultimately wanted this organization to be an African organization. Chris was African, I'm not. And we thought actually in this first phase, what do we need the board to be? We need we need a board which is going to be good at setting up an organization, getting the organization established, getting the thing launched, getting the funding in, getting recruiting a good team, getting good processes so that the thing was very well governed, because in terms of raising funding and sustaining success, we wanted that. So initially, we had a very small board. We had three of us to start with. Then we recruited a CEO. We wanted to have a CFO, but we didn't quite have the funding at the beginning or the scale to justify a full CFO. But that was our plan. So we planned for probably about 5 years hence. But it wasn't so much the years, it was the steps. So what do we need the board to be once we've raised capital, we're starting to do work. We had a clear idea about what sort of partners we wanted in terms of funding partners, other strategic partners, and we thought about, well, what would they want to see in the board that we have? So we were constantly thinking. Today, I'm the only non-African on the board. We have board members in Ghana, Kenya, We've had Uganda, Zambia, um, and soon we'll have Senegal. So we have a diverse group in terms of geography. We have a diverse group in terms of their experiences. We have a diverse group in terms of age. So we have a broad range of ages on the board as well. We now have a really strong senior leadership team, with a CFO, a CEO, a CFO, and a couple of others. There are four. Um, and we have subcommittees. At the beginning, we realized we would want to have subcommittees. So, we basically just set up two, an audit and risk committee and a nominations and remuneration committee, and that's been sufficient for the stage that we are at the moment. We have two legal entities. So we have a legal entity in the UK and one in Ghana. And so we need a board for the Ghana operations. And also, we want to make sure those two boards operate well together. Um, and so we have some common members of those two boards and so on. So we're constantly thinking about what is the next sort of step, what is the next scale. And if you're a startup in the venture space, of course, you might be thinking of an IPO or an exit. What's the board you need to get you to that thing? So I think it's really about building a board with the skills and diversity which are relevant for what you're trying to do. So for us, it's really important that we have a mix of people who understand the education space, who understand technology, who understand how to build an organization, who understand how different places in Africa work and how to work with very large foundation funders, for example. So we have achieved, I think, for our relative scale, really good diversity and a really good skill set.
Thank you, Patrick. The key message here, especially if you are an early stage business, is really to stay ahead of the curve, really, because
Yeah, I
yeah,
think so.
so really
Yeah,
anticipating what the business needs, and but each business is unique, as you have really pointed out. So say, for example, if you are a business that needs funding quite intensively, then you have to think about investor relation. So you
yeah,
have to think about maybe earlier for a CFO, because that's what gives confidence to an investor effectively. So and there are situations where investment agreements, for example, might actually dictate the board. I remember I've been in a situation where the investment agreement dictated, in a way, the presence of certain competence in the business. So yeah, it's important to always anticipate this. Yeah, I would say.
yeah. And one thing that a lot of people will wrestle with, particularly if you're a founder, is should you have an independent chair?
Mm.
Um, I I like that, and maybe planning for that. That helps to deal with founder syndrome. It helps to deal with all sorts of things. But you've got to make the right choice in doing that.
Yeah, independent
Um,
chair is yeah, it was really good, with the right balance, obviously. And yeah, I mean, the evolution starts initially with the founder
yeah,
really becoming a CEO. That's not an easy path for many. I would say it's probably the most difficult one, because you have to
yeah,
change completely who you are from startup to scale up in particular.
yeah,
And then we got the executive versus non-executive director remuneration.
yeah.
Particularly, when we're talking about purpose-driven or non-profits board. Tell me about your perspective, Patrick, from your experience.
Well, in many countries, the non-executives are called trustees in not-for-profits, and you can't pay them. It's against the law or the regulation. to pay them. So you have a group of people, often who put in a lot of time, a lot of effort, and actually hold the accountability and the responsibility, but they're not paid. And then you have the executives who, they're driven by the cause, they're driven by the purpose, but they're doing an executive job. They should be paid executive salary. I think in the UK there's been quite a lot of talk around what are appropriate levels of pay for you know people in larger charities, particularly where they're running you know organizations which are often bigger, more complicated, more challenging than many commercial organizations. Uh, and attracting people is important. It's always a question of balance, and you generally want someone running your organization, if it's a not-for-profit or a purpose-led organization, who really, really gets the purpose and is driven by the purpose. They're not just doing a job for the money. Um, but on the other hand, you need to attract great talent, and you need to have them fulfilled and rewarded. The area which is very different is, there tend not to be long-term incentive plans of the same nature as in corporates. Bonuses, a large number of charities just don't pay bonuses to the executive. So the interesting thing is, if you're on a board and you're recruiting people and you're not going to pay them long-term incentive plan through long-term incentive plans or bonuses and things, then you need to ensure that you're delivering on those other things that they would need to motivate them. So, you can't treat them like a hired hand in the same way that you might do if you're paying someone, very serious amount of money to deliver certain things. It's just a different relationship. Um, my feeling is that non-profit boards need to operate in, the same degree of highly professional, I think business-like in the sense of, being well organized and rigorous and those sorts of things, which not all businesses are as well, if we're straightforward about it. But you need to have that balance, I think. Having a remuneration committee is the way that most people deal with this, making sure that remuneration committee is well advised, so you understand what the benchmarks are for pay, for the structure of remuneration, and so on is really important. In the charity sector, I mean, most people would combine the nominations and remunerations committee because there isn't the same level of work to do on the remuneration committee as there generally is in the commercial sector. That can be different with very international purpose-led organizations. It can be very complicated when you're paying people, particularly if you're transferring people around different places. The logistics of the remuneration and all of that can be quite complicated. So having a remuneration committee is a good way of doing it.
I think you're right. Remuneration committee is in some situation actually quite fundamental, shall we say? Because I've seen
Mm.
some, but obviously we're talking about uh, advanced, obviously, business, in the not necessarily early stage, but quite mature,
Mm.
especially when there are political pressures, of all sorts, with various stakeholders, so. And
Mm.
I presume your experience, you had lots of experience of situations where, stakeholders are, well, demand certain things that have to come from
Yeah. Yeah.
establishing committee, I would say, yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the things that I tend to hear a lot myself personally, but obviously in general, in several industries, is about how long does in appointment last really. Now, the question I wanted to ask you, obviously, with your experience again, so many years, really, so many decades. Um, what do you think about this? Is board refreshment not used enough? And what happens when, for example, the boards get stuck with position, with certain character or characteristic? What's your view on this?
My view is actually, and what I like is a sort of constant refreshment.
Hmm.
So, what I mean by that is not everyone changing all the time, but actually, if you have a policy of saying in a board, we probably expect non-executives to serve 2, 3 year terms. That's the sort of expectation. We review every year whether that person is delivering, whether they're getting fulfilled and so on. Um, but if you have that and you have an average sized board of, from 6 to 8, 9, that kind of number, then you're going to have someone every year. Uh, at least if you do that. And I like the idea of having someone who's served a full term and they can be more reflective and they add a lot, often add a lot in that last year. If you work that right. And I love the idea of having someone new who's asking, all those questions maybe we asked a few years ago, but actually the time is different. And just because we asked them a few years ago and we had answers in a certain way doesn't mean that that's the right answer today. So I think that benefit of someone who's new and benefit of someone who is going can be really powerful. Um, I think it's very dangerous to try and microwave boards. Um, and it's very hard work if you're a chair, if you have suddenly 4 or 5 new board members. I've experienced that. It's worked well, but it's a different situation than if you have this constant. So I am always well, there's 2 organizations I'm chair of at the moment, and I spend a decent amount of time thinking about with the chair of the nominations committee, what's the next thing we need? What's the next thing we want? So, in the case of ESSA, that was we're expanding our work in Francophone Africa. So we need to add additional, you know, knowledge, wisdom around and networks around the Francophone African world. So that's where we've been. We were thinking that 2 years ago. We started the process of thinking about when would be the right time to add that person, and it so happens it's very soon now, and we have what we think is a fantastic candidate for that. And the way that we did that was through everyone's antennae being up, probably for 2 years, in terms of well, let's think about what sort of person we want, where, and all the rest of it, and then using our networks and knowledge to sort of identify someone who would have the right blend. In public companies, the codes determine, that you have those rotations, and people lose their independent sort of status if they're too long. Um, I think for chairs, there's a debate, and some people feel that 6 years is too short, that it should be 9, and different companies have different forms of that. Um, One of the things that I was involved in many years ago was the Higgs Review, and the Higgs Review was a review of corporate governance of large listed UK companies. And one of the things at the time that we observed was there were uh, probably a large number of chairs who had served for a very long time. And institutions had, in some cases, suggested, refreshing a change of chair, but nothing was happening. And one of the things that was defined and created through the Higgs Review was the role of the senior independent director. So a person who institutions could go to say, look, we really feel there should be change of chair. We've discussed it with the chair, but nothing is happening here. But also, as well as that function, if you like, the chair role is very demanding, very time consuming, and the senior independent role would be like a deputy chair. Um, Very importantly, though, the Derek Higgs, the late great Sir Derek Higgs, um, made the point that it's probably a good idea if that senior independent director isn't a candidate to be the chair, because then they can have that sort of more independent. If they're the person who wants to be chair and they're talking to the chair about moving moving on, that's probably not a good thing. So and that role of the senior independent director, that's now 23 years, I think, since then. But that role has stuck. I mean, most companies have senior independent directors who are public companies, and a lot of smaller organizations have the same role. They may call them different things. In the social sector in the UK, they might be the senior trustee or the vice chair or the deputy chair, that kind of thing. So I think that's a helpful mechanism when you have someone who wants to stay on too long. But term limits are really important, and they should be stated in appointment letters.
Thank you, Patrick. And this actually, when we see businesses, again, each situation is unique, but
Mm.
we need to balance sometimes, what we see as a necessity with however, other situation, like for example, where some chairman could become such an important point of reference for stakeholders that imagining the company without them sometimes could be quite a shock. It could be potentially also damage to the image of the business. So that
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
did it happen to you sometimes? Yeah.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, you don't have to do add those valuable things to an organization always through the chair role. So some people might have them as a patron or, an ambassador or something like that, where they're still connected with the organization, but they're not running the governance. That's the distinction I would have. So, for example, I helped EY found the EY Foundation in the UK in 2014. It's been very successful. I was chair for the first 10 years um, and I retired. And they were keen to keep the connectivity and some of the relationships. So they asked if I would be a patron, and I was, very pleased to do that. But I was really clear, and EY were really clear as well that that shouldn't be any involvement in the governance. Um, so I stepped down as chair. I became a patron. I speak at some things. I help to raise money. I, have some relationships with some of the key stakeholders, but I don't get involved in, I don't attend board meetings. Um, I don't serve on any of the committees, that kind of thing. But I love it. I love the organization. I love what it does. It helps, young people in poverty to have a better route to education and work, better path to employment. I really feel very strongly about that as a cause. And so I will, if they ask me to speak somewhere, if they ask me to do something, I will generally do it. But if they asked me to serve on a board committee, I wouldn't.
Okay.
And they
I
never
think
have.
thank you for giving your very special perspective, your experience as well, because obviously, yeah, when you live through these things, you're able to explain them a lot better as well. Yeah. Okay.
Hopefully.
Okay. So now let's come to the next phase.